My name is Professor John Benjamin, and this is West Virginia Wesleyan College, and this is Game Design. And today we're going to talk about the history of games, a brief history of games. So the first thing that we want to ask is, well, what are the origins of games? If we look at animals, really of any mammalian species, we've witnessed them playing in a variety of different ways. And biologists, of course, believe that play is important for social, physical, and cognitive development, and that it prepares animals for the unexpected, as well as preparing for adult activities. So, we can see this in humans as well. And so, again, if all of this is true, then there really is no origins. That games are just part of who we are, and have always been, if you will. But some of the earliest examples, artifacts of games, would be the Knucklebone Dice. So Knucklebone Dice are dice that are made from the talus bone or the ankle bone of an animal. And it can roll and land on 6 sides. And these have been found in archaeological sites all over the world, the earliest being around 3000 BCE. And here's an example of the kingdom in Turkey in 800 BCE, with children are holding and throwing knucklebone dice. In Greece, in ancient Greece, they would paint on them, put different numbers and symbols, and different people would use them different ways. Children would throw them up and catch them on the back of their hand. So women in ancient Greece would use them primarily to predict the future, and men for a game of chance or to gamble. I think the interesting thing, though, with the Greeks is when they threw the dice, the side that landed down was the score that you received. One of the earliest board games, or the earliest board game, that we know of is the royal game of which has been discovered as early as 2600 BCE, before the Common Era. The object of the game is to run the course of the board. It's sort of a chase game, and bear all of one's pieces before one's opponent. And it's sort of like modern backgammon. The game combines both elements of strategy and luck, which are two really important aspects of games that we want to be cognizant of when we design games. This was played until late antiquity, that meaning a few hundred years after the fall of Rome, really throughout the world. But then it really fell out of favor, really dropped off the map for a variety of reasons, probably. Backgammon, which is an actually extremely old game as well, but did pick up in popularity at certain times. But the interesting thing is, in the Indian town of Kochi, an Indian city, it was discovered that there was a Jewish population there that was still playing this game in the 1950s. Mancala, to some archaeologists, might be arguably even older. We have pretty early evidence, 1400 BC in Memphis, Egypt. We have the Mancala game carved into the roofs of buildings in Memphis. But there is some archaeological evidence. Some experts believe that there is evidence discovered in Jordan that roughly dates to around 6000 BCE. So Mancala could be the oldest. Mancala is derived from the Arabic word nankala, which means to move. So this is sort of a move and chase game, not that dissimilar in some ways to the royal game for Go is considered by most people to be the oldest continually played game in history. It originated in the Zhou dynasty, around roughly 1000 BCE. It's a 2-player strategy game in which the aim is to surround more territory than your opponents. The name Go, interestingly enough, is derived from the Japanese word ego, and that comes from the Chinese, where the game was originated, again, the Zhou dynasty of Huiji, which means encirclement board game. So again, names usually refer to how to play. And that takes us to Chacharango. It's a strategy board game developed in the Gupta Empire in the 3rd century CE. Chacharuga, Sanskrit, meaning having 4 limbs or parts. And that's because you use 4 quadrants that are based on the 3rd century military arrangement, the 4 parts of the military of an Indian army. And this is the precursor to chess. That's why it's an important and notable game that made its way much, much later into Europe and became chess. Playing cards. Paper was invented in China in 100 CE, so paper had been around for a long time. Playing cards didn't really surface until 900 CE, and originally they were just paper dominoes, a very popular game. And the faces would be usually characters in popular novels at the time. And cards, though, finally made it to Europe around the 14th century through Africa and the Middle East. And the game that made it there was the game of Naib, which is a 52 card deck game. And here's an example of an existing card that survived from 1500 CE. So Parcheesi is a game that was invented in India in 800 BCE. So a very, very old game. It's derived, the Parchees, it's derived from the Hindi word, which means 25. And this, again, is a chase and take game, or chase and catch game. Really, you're just trying to move around the board counterclockwise, and the first person that gets to the center. The game of Parcheesi, you're on a cloth board, again, moving counterclockwise till you get to the center. So the important part here, though, is this game was imported to England from India in the 1860s and then renamed Parcheesi. And then it was finally trademarked, the first trademarked game to be mass-produced in the United States. So this really, kicks off the board game race. So really important to point out here that, again, strategy, war-type games are immensely popular. It's something that's just probably humans just like to do. Maybe even, again, like animals playing, sort of preparing, if you will. So this is an activity that's gone on for a long time. But what happens in 1780 is the King's Game was created by Hellwig Master of Pages in Germany. So this is a game with a board of 1,666 squares of varying terrains, and then having pieces that reflected different pieces of military. So again, just a really elaborate game of chess, if you will, but very popular, particularly among the aristocracy. And then here you can see a 19th century illustration. In a newspaper, H.G. Wells is playing an indoor war game. So again, there were societies and groups, and people would get together and play these elaborate minifigure games. So jumping forward, again, this is a very popular activity. Lots of societies do this. Gary Gygax invented chainmail, which is a minifig medieval war game that you could purchase. And it sort of brought that into the board game realm. Chainmail was a sort of medieval war game characters. But then, not that much later, 1974, Gygax works with Dave Amundsen to create Dungeons and Dragons. So same idea of chainmail to a large extent, but now adding that fantasy element. And so this is really a critical point to pause and just recognize that, again, video games, RPG games, really are derived from these miniature wargaming activities that, again, have just been popular throughout the centuries. So that takes us, jump to 1947, into the very first video game. And so that was created in 1947. Thomas D. Goldsmith Jr. and Cecil Ray Mann filed a patent for the cathode ray tube amusement device. Great name, CRT Amusement Device, in 1947. And so this was just inspired and based on radar technology that was seen on TV and in movies. And essentially, you could two knobs, you could control a little dot, and you could change the film to have different targets and things that you could place over it. And you had to keep score by writing it down with a pen or pencil. But this inspired, many years later, 14 years later, MIT students to create Space War. And so here's a game, again, it looks very similar, where you flew spaceships and you fired missiles at each other. It's a two-player game. And then the very first arcade game developed at Stanford. So in 1971, Bill Pitts and Hugh Tuck developed the first dime-operated vector graphic machine called Space War, again, based off of the original Space War, which was based off of the cathode ray amusement device. And so they built this thing on campus and made some money by collecting dimes. I think there was only 2 of them at Stanford, and they just stayed there, I think, into the 1990s where they were decommissioned. So they were never mass-produced. But the first mass-produced video game was called Computer Space in 1971, created by Noam Bushnell and Ted Dabney. They called it Computer Space, but really similar inspiration, and it was manufactured by Ziggy Engineering. So this is the first commercially mass-produced video game. You can see it here next to a pinball machine. So these would be put in restaurants and bars and places like that. It was commercially unsuccessful, though, because it had a steep learning curve. It was just too complicated. So here's a moment to pause, Hugh, just to stop and think about how complicated is your game? How do you teach your player? How does the player learn as progressively? Is it too complicated? And, not that really complicated games are fine, but who's your target audience? So if it's a niche market where it's really, really a lot of complicated rules, that's fine. But you always want to be mindful of that. So that takes us into the 1970s with mainframe computers became really popular. So most of this is going on at universities, but with the Digital Equipment Corporation, the DEC computers that were sold to universities and large corporations, now a lot of people, not just at the universities, could start to develop games. So this is a really important time in the development of video games because DEC developed the Digital Computer User Society. Pardon me, this is a volunteer society where people would use DEC computers. Some games would be installed, but then they create their own games and they share it across the network. And so this was just a great collaborative time for the development of computer games. And another big player here was Plato at the University of Illinois. That was programmed logic for automatic teaching operations. So this was a software that ran on the DEC computers as well that people would use to make games, educational games and other games. So these are two big players, and we saw between 71 and 1977 Earl Weaver Baseball, Star Trek, Hunt the Wumpus, Maze War Adventure, and Dungeons and Dragons. So this was a really big push forward. And then we get to the Magnavox Odyssey. So this story begins a few years back in 1960. Everybody's got a television set. They're hugely popular, and Ralph Baer decides, hey, how can we play games on this? And so he developed a prototype, and here you can see an image of it. He had called it the brown box type. And so he had worked on it for a lot of years and then had trouble getting some licensing until finally he licensed it to Magnavox. And they created the very first commercial home video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey. It's a pretty impressive looking piece of industrial design. You know, pretty much the same hardware, but the outside looks pretty sleek. I'm pretty impressed. And this came pre-wired with about 20 or so games, including table tennis, football, cat and mouse, and submarine. And you can see here table tennis. It had color, and it had little cartridges, but they just had little teeth. There was nothing on them, and they just told the computer what game to play. But everything was hardwired. But it gave you the feeling of choice for a cartridge. So this was really what broke out the first generation of consoles. So that takes us to Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. So they said, Bushnell got together with Dabney and said, we're gonna let's get into this market, and they formed Atari. And a lot of people think Atari is a Japanese company, but both Dabney and Bushnell really like the game of Go. And in Go, when you say checkmate or last round played, you say Atari, and so that's where the name came from. So Dabney, on his first assignment, sort of comes up with what he calls Pong. Now, he had played and was aware of table tennis and the games on the Odyssey. He thought table tennis was boring, and so he basically jazzed it up, made it more interactive with Pong. And so they made these consoles that they put in a friend's bar, and it was really successful. And then they mass-produced more of the cabinets, and that was really successful. So he said, how can we enter into this console market? And they came up with Pong, and they also needed someone to sell it. They manufactured their Pong device, their home device, but they needed someone to sell it. And so they went to Sears, and Sears bought into it, and they sold it originally under Sears Telegames. And they sold the Pong game, and I think I had a few other games with it. And it was hugely successful. It really, really exploded. It had a low price point. It's just a really incredibly popular game. What happened then is it was really easy to produce these. The tech was really simple, and so you had tons and tons of Pong clones all over the place, creating a glut in the market. And people, again, eventually became bored and got a lot of real low-quality machines. And that caused the first generation crash of video games. They kind of really went away. People lost interest. And really at the same time, too, Baer was pretty upset. He recognized that Pong looked exactly like table tennis. And they sued, and Atari settled out of court. But Atari still survived. They did so well. Or all the other game companies did not. And then that brings 78 to 86, the golden age of arcade games we need to talk about. And this is all initiated by Tato's release of Space Invaders in 1978. It was just a smash hit. There was just Space Invaders mania. And they sold 360,000 units, and they popped up all over malls and restaurants all over the world. It was huge, hugely popular. And riding on their success, Atari came out with their cabinet of Asteroids, which is a really fun game. And kind of similar concept, but again, more advanced. You could spin around and shoot the asteroids. Had to get out of the ball. And then Galaxian by Namco. They sold 40,000 cabinets. And Galaxian was sort of like a more advanced, more colorful version of Space Invaders. And so by 1981, the arcade industry was generating $5 billion annually, which is equivalent to $20 billion today, and is pretty impressive. Now, today, right now, I think in 2019, the game industry, kind of as a collective, made about $120 billion. So $20 billion is pretty impressive. And then in 1980, Pac-Man was released, and it sold $2.5 billion in a quarter. So that was just, it's called Pac-Man fever. It was really, really. So that takes us to the second generation of video games. So Atari's really getting their act together. They've come up with some really great games and some ideas. And so we come up with the second generation of consoles. The first of which was the Fairchild Channel F in 1976. It's a CPU-based video game, and it had 26 cartridges, and it met with some pretty great success. But what Atari did the next year is, okay, they came up with a cartridge system with a detachable joystick. And but they had a lower price point, and the graphics were far more inferior. But then they released it with Space Invaders, and then so that was really what got them their toehold in this industry. And we'll see that pattern happening throughout time. It's really about the games. Graphics are important. Quality is really a really important part of this. And then later on, the tail end of that, we have 1983, ColecoVision comes up. They've got sort of faux vectors, really advanced graphics and gameplay, a really superior machine. I had one, and I just thought it was fantastic. Although I never loved it as much as my Atari 2600, which was a huge part of my childhood. But the problem with Coleco is, even though it had quite a range of games, it was too late. By 1982, there was just another glut of bad games. And so it became very easy to create, design, and manufacture a cartridge. And so a bunch of clones were out there from different arcade games, and they were all really, really bad. And so viewers and gamers just got really bored. And the real nail in the coffin, if you will, was E.T. So there's this big excitement. E.T. had come out, and this one really, I don't recall his name, but he was a really great top of the game design. He was feeling pretty good about himself, and he said, "Yeah, I can do this ET game." And he got the go ahead from Spielberg, and but he had like 2 months to do it, to get it out before Christmas, and he just created a total flop. And that's really what we like to think of as the marker or the nail in the coffin of the big second generation video game crash, and everyone just became really bored with home console video games. Arcade games still doing great. Home computers, 70s and 80s. So the Apple computer was really huge. It came with Tetris and a whole variety of other games. The Commodore 64 was also really popular at a much lower price point. And the neat thing about the Commodore, of course, was it was just a keyboard with the memory inside, and you could insert cartridges and discs and attach things to it. But most anyone could afford to buy a Commodore, and you could design your own games and program it like a regular computer. So these two really, what they did is they initiated the amateur market for programmers. So you had a whole host of people designing really interesting games for themselves and just making copies on floppy disks or cassettes and selling them in Ziploc bags through the mail, and sometimes through a local store and whatnot. So this amateur programmer market was really, really a cool advent with the home personal computer. And that takes us to the third generation consoles, 8-bit. Just 8 bits was, if you think about it, 8 bits of information could be processed at one time. And so this was a big game changer. So graphics and sound became a lot better. The two companies that released big consoles with the 8 bits was the Nintendo Famicom released the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, and Sega Enterprises released the Sega Genesis 1000. And these third gen introduced improved graphics and sound quality, like I said. But what Nintendo did was it gave us the gamepad, or the D-pad part, the directional pad, instead of the joystick. Sonic the Hedgehog was the big selling point for Sega, and that really held its ground for a long time, but Nintendo was really the big winner here with great franchises that it was developing with Super Mario Bros., which was extremely popular, Legends of Zelda, Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and Metal Gear. And then in 1988, Nintendo did a really cool thing. They had a lot of really cool marketing ideas, but they came out with Nintendo Power Magazine, which was a magazine where you'd have the maps for like Super Mario and all of these different games and cheat codes and things like that, things that we can find online today, but before you get a subscription to this magazine. So Nintendo was really, really smart about franchising and marketing. And then Nintendo comes out with portable games. They come out with the Game Boy, which just is a total game changer, in 1989. And then Nintendo just dominates the market with this really brilliant device. And then they subsequently in 2004 with the DS and then the 3DS in 2010. And lots of other different small handheld devices were out there. The PlayStation came out with the PSP. There's numerous amounts of them, but nobody ever held a candle to Nintendo. And again, the real big selling point with the Game Boy was it came with Tetris. And it was just addictive. I mean, I loved it. Again, Sega and Atari came out with handhelds that had better graphics, but they didn't have the game library, the game franchises, and they drained your batteries. They used a lot of memory, and they were a little more expensive. And then kind of jumping ahead to the late 90s, so we have cell phones, and cell phone gaming became pretty popular, mostly in Japan, but definitely throughout the world. When Nokia released games like Snake, which became really popular. And the mobile game market, did really, really blossom at that time. But it was hard. It did drain your phone battery, and it was pretty much just LED graphics. And even some phones that had color graphics, that drained your battery even more, and the screen was always really tiny. But it wasn't until 2008 with the iPhone that everything changed, and mobile gaming became, well, really, I think it's at least half of the market now. Okay, 1988 to 1999. The fourth generation console, 16-bit. So now we've got a really, really huge jump here. And Sega jumps in, and they give us a CD drive. And that was really revolutionary. You had low polygon 3D graphics. So that was a total game changer. But Nintendo, again, they always play this game of like not going too big on the graphics and the processing power. They kind of keep the games real simple. So they released the Super Nintendo, which was a 16-bit player, but it came with this awesome library of franchised games again. So again, Super Mario Brothers, among others, that were just so popular. So Nintendo dominates the market, and Sega takes a backseat. But then 1993 to 2006, this is when things really start to happen. We have the fifth generation of consoles. And so there's 3 or 4 big players on the market at this time. Atari Jaguar, Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, and the Nintendo 64. And PlayStation outperforms them all. It's got great performance, and above all, it's got really, really great games. And one of the things that happens with PlayStation is they sort of break open to the adult market. Games like Resident Evil, which is a kind of not really open world, but it's a horror game. But you can explore it. They use a really smart combination of 2D graphic backgrounds with 3D models that you can move around in the space. And it moved away from the first-person shooter to more of a mystery kind of solving game, or combine a bunch of games. It was just hugely popular. And so then what this opened up is a whole market to adult gaming. So this is primarily a market just for kids up into this part. But now we've got these scary horror games with adult content, and PlayStation sort of really began that. Nintendo 64 had a slow start, but again, it's doing really well. It's got games like Super Mario 64, Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and GoldenEye 007, which is a really excellent 3D game. So they're really still holding their own. But one of the things that does happen with Nintendo at this point is they start to become seen as a niche, a kids gaming console. And again, where PlayStation's more adult content, so we have this split happening. So all throughout the late 90s and the early 2000s, PC computers with Windows and internet access are becoming more and more prevalent. And so you have games like, software developers like ID creating games like Quake, which you can play. It's a first-person shooter that you can play with other people over the internet. So this is a breakthrough. And then also real-time strategy games, such as developed by Microsoft Studios here, Microsoft Game Studios, Age of Empires, Blizzard's, and then Blizzard's, of course, Warcraft and StarCraft. So these are real big game changers as far as playing over the internet with friends. And then we have, in 2002, Grand Theft Auto 3. So before this, it's just a 2D pixel game. Now it's a 3D open world game. And we've never seen anything like this before, just a complete breakthrough, the non-linear open world game with Grand Theft Auto. It came out on Sony and on PC, and just, it's just a huge, huge game changer. It also, that along with Resident Evil and a few other adult games, inspired the T&M rating system. And then the other really cool thing in 1999 that you have that I think is just fabulous was, again, so you have all these personal computers, so you're having software, people that understand software, computer science people, creating user-created modifications to games that they bought on their computer, which I just think is the best. It's just creating this whole collaborative worldwide network of creativity. And so the first one that was really, really big was Counter-Strike, which was developed as a mod from Valve's Half-Life, which I'm always just really impressed by. And then we get to the 6th generation consoles. This is where Microsoft enters into the console market. Up until this point, they're just all about Windows and developing software for Windows and PCs. Also, an important thing, this is where Sega really dies. So Sega does a thing in 1998, they're already hurting, and they come out with the Sega Dreamcast, which actually is revolutionary. This is the first console that has a built-in modem, and you can play games online. So should have been a game changer, but they just didn't have, they hadn't had to build up the fan base or the franchises really that well, like PlayStation is doing. They've got a niche, Nintendo's got a niche, and Sega just didn't have that popularity, even though they came out with this breakthrough technology that a lot of people wanted. And one of the really hard things was, even though it came out, I think, in 98, people were waiting for the PS2 to come out. That anticipation just kind of crushed them, and that was really the end of Sega. And Nintendo comes out with the GameCube. This is their first device with a laser disc, and now their sales are really suffering. So they're just seen as a kids' gaming platform, and the real market now is for more adult content, and so they just can't keep up with the PlayStation and all of their games. But then again, Microsoft says, okay, we're going to come up with a console, and we're not going to do anything crazy or different. We're just going to use PC technology. And the really smart thing that they did, which they can do because they were Microsoft, is they sold it at a loss. So it came at a pretty low price point compared to the PlayStation. And so that was really huge. But again, the real kicker is it came out with Halo. And Halo is a game changer. That really put the Xbox in footing with the PlayStation. That was just such an awesome and popular game, Halo Combat Evolved by Bungie. So in the PC world, online gaming really balloons with the advent of faster broadband connections that are more affordable, like America Online. And so now we have the very first MMORPGs, which is just so exciting. And so games such as, I'll play on the PC, RuneScape, World of Warcraft, EverQuest, Ultima Online, all became super popular. And then at this time, okay, knowing that this is where gaming is going, Microsoft releases Xbox Live, and that's a huge success because it's Halo 2 again. So you've got this Halo; it's a console specific game, and now you can play it, online with friends. And Sony also offered a service which wasn't quite as successful, bringing us to the 7th generation consoles. So in 2005, Xbox releases the Xbox 360, which now comes with Xbox Live, and you can order content, you can download it. It's got a 1 terabyte hard drive, a lot more processing power. And then the PS3 does something really crazy. They come up with a machine that's got Blu-rays, more processing power, Wi-Fi, but now it's even more than twice the cost of the Xbox. It's fully loaded, and it doesn't really hurt their sales too much. It's just a superior game console. But then Nintendo comes up with the Wii and motion controls. And so this is a complete game changer. Although at first they just game designers and game developers and the community just thought it was a novelty. But what they didn't know was it was going to explode the casual gaming market. And even today, the most highly sold games are pretty much lumped under Nintendo because they're just really opened up for such a wide market. Grandma and Uncle Jed can play with Junior play Wii Golf or Wii Tennis, and it's just super fun. And so that was just an overnight success. And this is the time around 2007. This is where developer budgets really bloom. So we've got the processing power now to develop really complicated, elaborate games. So we have big, large teams and lots of money right around 2007. And inspired by the Wii controller, Xbox comes in with the Kinect. And that was actually just hugely successful. Everybody had to have a Kinect. Here it used motion controls or motion capture, where you could it captured your body movements. You didn't need a controller at all. So this really was revolutionary, but strangely enough, only lasted for about a year. People got bored of it. Not sure, the particulars of that. But also around this time, a really cool time, around 2008, is where networking sites like MySpace and Facebook come up with the casual PC games. And so these are just casual gamers playing Happy Farm, Mafia Wars, and Diner Dash, all really great games that were really hugely successful financially as well. Takes us to the 8th generation. We're almost up to modern times. The Wii U released in 2011. Really cool idea, but it was a flop. I remember thinking about buying one, and it just didn't have the same fun as the regular Wii. It had a pretty high price point, but there was this idea that you could have a game that you could play handheld and on the TV. It just wasn't quite there yet, and people didn't really buy into it. And the Wii, again, was still really popular. So it was a total wash, a total commercial failure. And then Xbox One and PS4, now they're neck and neck competing. Xbox One comes out, it's got, this is the 1 terabyte. I think I said that about the 360. It's got the terabyte hard drive, 4K resolution. And then the PS4 comes out emphasizing the social aspect of this. So you can stream from the PS4 or with Twitch. And so again, PC gaming always leading the way, and consoles sort of catching up to those trends. And then finally, we get 2017 with the real revolution, the Nintendo Switch, just financially incredibly successful game launch. It's got a low price point. You've got motion controllers, you've got handheld gaming, you've got big, blockbuster, complicated games that you can play on it, and you can just drop it in and it plays on your TV. And now, like Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, you can play up to 8 players, all with motion controls. It's just, you don't really use motion controls with Ultimate, but anyways. It was just really a huge success. And the really smart thing that I always like to pride Nintendo for. So here's a game that they work really hard to save processing power. And so it doesn't have a lot of processing power. It's a handheld. And yet they've done this with all their other games too, especially with the DS. They become really great experts of coming up with really great environments that are really appealing without a lot of processing power. And Zelda Breath of the Wild is a perfect example. This is probably the most fun open world game and the most beautiful open world game, and everything's kind of low res. They're just really smart in where they choose to put it. I just think it's really quite remarkable. And that takes us to today. And so in class, we'll have a discussion probably about where gaming is going and what happened with Cyberpunk 2077. And I think a lot of what happened with Cyberpunk we can really take away from all of these other examples in this history. And I'd like to take a moment, too, to just take a look at what could be surprising is some of the most popular games. And so what's made the most money, sold the most games? And, of course, it's Mojang's Minecraft is at the top, one of my personal favorites. I still play Minecraft. And then, of course, Grand Theft Auto right there, Tetris, all these games, Wii Sports. This one is really always surprises me. And PUBG, that it was that financially successful. It made that much money. It's great. Super Mario Brothers, but we get a whole lot of Wii and Wii Fit games. Not Wii Fit, but just like Wii games down here. But Red Dead Redemption's no surprise. Call of Duty, Skyrim, all just really, really fantastic games. Well, it's important. What I'd like to talk just a little bit about is the franchises. And you'll see the most financially successful franchise at the top of the list is Call of Duty. And Mario's right up there as a great franchise. And you move down the list and you'll see Halo again and Fortnite and just a host of other games. And just to see how well the franchises hold up to the individual games. So that was my brief history of games. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something, and I'll see you in class.